That's what the witnesses remembered most. Not the sword, not the blood, not even the silence that fell when her head hit the straw. It was the smile. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England's second wife to Henry VIII, stepped onto the scaffold at Tower Green on a crisp May morning in 1536. She moved with quiet grace, dressed simply in gray, her long neck exposed to the wind. No crown, no court, just the faint sound of birdsong in the air, and a crowd thirsty for closure. She looked out at them, these nobles and servants, these former friends and bitter enemies, and she smiled. To most, it seemed strange, out of place, inappropriate even. But the truth behind that smile is more disturbing than any history book will tell you, because Anne wasn't just walking to her death. She was walking through the final act of one of the most chilling performances in royal history, and she knew it. This wasn't just an execution, it was erasure. You've heard the headline: she was beheaded for adultery and treason. A scandal, a trial, a sword, the end. But if that's all you know, you've missed the real story. You've missed the slow, surgical dismantling of a woman's identity. You've missed the gaslighting, the staged betrayals, the calculated delays meant to break her mind before her body was ever touched. What happened to Anne Boleyn in the final weeks of her life wasn't just a political maneuver. It was a psychological operation, a brutal campaign to destroy not just her life, but her legacy. And in the end, even her final moments, her posture, her poise, her infamous composure were used against her, turned into footnotes, smoothed over in textbooks, sanitized. But not here. This is not the story of a queen who died. This is the story of how power tried to make her disappear and failed. Ready for Chapter 1, The Rise Nobody Saw Coming. Anne Boleyn was never supposed to be queen. She wasn't born into the kind of bloodline that naturally bends toward crowns. She wasn't the daughter of kings or even of dukes. Her father was a diplomat, clever and well-positioned, but far from royal. And Anne herself, she was too sharp, too outspoken, too aware of her own power. She was everything a Tudor woman wasn't supposed to be, and that's exactly what made her irresistible. At the English court, she was a storm in silk. Educated in the courts of Europe, fluent in French, bold. In conversation, Anne didn't just flirt, she fenced. Her wit was quick, her gaze unflinching. While others bowed their heads, she raised her chin. And when Henry VIII turned his gaze on her, she didn't swoon, she didn't beg. She said no, again and again. That no changed history. Henry had never heard it before, not from a woman, not from someone without a title or fortune to anchor her audacity. But Anne understood something other women didn't. The king wasn't used to being denied, and denial breeds obsession. So she waited, she maneuvered, she made herself not just desirable but essential. And slowly, impossibly, the unthinkable happened. The king moved heaven and earth to have her. He challenged the Pope. He restructured England's religious identity. He divorced a queen who had served him faithfully for decades, all for Anne. It was the kind of rise that legends are built on. But in Henry's court, legends have expiration dates. Anne didn't bring him a son. That was her original sin. And in a world where a woman's worth was tied to the contents of her womb, failure was unforgivable. But it wasn't just the lack of an heir that doomed her, it was the presence of her voice. She had opinions on foreign policy. She intervened in church appointments. She debated, she questioned, and she did it all in public. That made her dangerous. She wasn't merely a wife, she was a political force. And Henry, once drunk on her defiance, eventually grew tired of being outshined by it. The same traits that lifted her to the throne would become the very weapons used to take it away. Anne didn't fall from grace. She was pushed. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 2. The blueprint of a dismantling. Power doesn't simply vanish. It has to be dismantled systematically, piece by piece, until what remains is unrecognizable. By the spring of 1536, Anne Boleyn had become too large for the space allotted to her. She was no longer just the king's wife, she was an obstacle to Henry's legacy, to his pride, to his next marriage. And so the process of erasing her began not with violence, but with silence. The architect of her downfall wasn't the king himself. Henry was too invested, too emotional, too exposed. No, the knife was passed to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, a man who understood that in Tudor England the most effective executions began long before the blade ever touched flesh. He started with the court whispers. Cromwell seeded rumors of adultery, not just one affair, but many, not just scandal, but perversion. He chose targets carefully: poets, musicians, courtiers, men Anne had laughed with in public, her brother George Boleyn, handsome, ambitious, too close. The accusations weren't just damning, they were designed to disgust, to isolate her even before she was officially accused. Then came the interrogations, the arrests, the forced confessions plucked from frightened lips under threat of torture. One man broke, the others were simply swept away. Their stories didn't matter, their guilt was predetermined. Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and high treason, a trifecta of crimes so outrageous it read like satire. The dates of the supposed encounters didn't align with her whereabouts. Some men accused were out of the country, others barely knew her, but that wasn't the point. This wasn't a pursuit of truth, it was a performance of legitimacy. Because in order to kill a queen, you first have to convince the world she's not one. Anne stood trial in a hastily assembled court packed with enemies and former allies, too scared to speak. She defended herself eloquently, logically, fearlessly. But logic had left the building long before she entered. The verdict had been written in the same ink as the accusations. Guilty, not just of the crimes listed, but of the greater sin, being a woman who refused to kneel. Cromwell didn't just engineer a legal victory, he orchestrated a psychological collapse. He turned Anne's intelligence into arrogance, her poise into deceit, her boldness into betrayal. Every strength she had shown as queen was recast as a fatal flaw. What they were building wasn't just a case, it was a narrative. And once the pieces were in place, all that remained was to set the final scene. The execution wasn't the end, it was the punchline. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 3. The torture you can't see. When the verdict was delivered, the sentence came quickly. Death by beheading. But it didn't happen the next morning or even the day after. Instead, Anne Boleyn was left to sit with it day after day, night after sleepless night, inside the Tower of London, surrounded by whispers, stripped of everything but breath. And that delay, that wasn't mercy. That was the beginning of a different kind of execution, one that didn't rely on blades. It relied on silence. For 17 days, Anne waited. The date of her death shifted constantly. She would be told tomorrow, and then it wouldn't come. She would pray all night, chest tight with fear, only to be met by more waiting. Sleep became a memory. Food became irrelevant. Her body remained intact, but her mind began to fray. Modern psychologists have a name for this anticipatory trauma, a relentless state of dread where the body never shuts off its alarm. Cortisol floods the bloodstream. The brain dissociates. You begin to drift outside yourself, not as a comfort, but as a last defense. And that's what Anne did. Witnesses said she laughed, that she joked with her ladies, that she spoke of her execution with calm detachment. Some historians have tried to paint this as courage, but it wasn't courage. It was collapse. Her mind had nowhere else to go. She called herself Queen Anne sans tête, Queen Anne without a head. A gallows joke, yes, but one made by someone who had already started mourning herself. She spent her final night on her knees in prayer. Records say she requested the sacrament at 2 a.m., her lips moving endlessly through the darkness, trying to stay tethered to something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. But there was no comfort, no contact, no control. Her family was absent. Her daughter was silent. The court had vanished. Anne wasn't just awaiting execution. She was being unmade in slow motion. And then finally, the knock came. She was told that this time the sword was real. The delay was over. She rose, composed and careful, walking through the same corridors where she had once been crowned queen. Her ladies helped her dress. She made them promise not to cry. She didn't want tears to ruin the picture, because deep down she knew this wasn't just about her death. It was about the performance, and she understood perhaps better than anyone else what kind of theater she had been forced into. And still she played the part. Say the word when you're ready for chapter 4. The stage was set. Anne Boleyn didn't die in a dark dungeon. She died under a blue sky before a crowd on a platform deliberately built low to the ground, just 3 feet high, so everyone could see her, but no one would look up to her. This wasn't an execution. It was a message. The scaffold was erected on Tower Green, a space reserved for the most high-profile deaths. But unlike most executions, Anne's platform wasn't designed to elevate or honor. It was built to reduce. There would be no grandeur, no misty morning fog to obscure the crowd's view. Every detail was intentional, even the sunlight. Henry VIII wasn't there, of course. He was at Whitehall preparing to marry Jane Seymour. His absence spoke volumes. The woman he had once rewritten the laws of God to possess was now just a footnote, a mistake to be cleaned up, not mourned. But he still wanted it done right. He had sent for a French swordsman, a master of the horizontal slice, a cleaner death than the English axe. On the surface it seemed merciful, but underneath it was performance. It was elegance, the act of removing a queen with grace, with artistry. Even her destruction had to reflect his majesty. Anne climbed the scaffold, slowly guided by the very hands that used to serve her as queen. Her ladies adjusted her headdress, smoothed her dress. She gave them small nods of thanks, knowing they would be forced to handle her body in minutes. She was blindfolded, not to spare her, but to still her, to stop any last-minute flinch that might disrupt the choreography. And then came her final speech. She didn't plead, she didn't accuse. She simply said she died according to the law and she would not speak against it. She called Henry a gracious king. The words were hollow and everyone knew it, but they were necessary because she understood the stakes. One wrong word could damn her daughter. One unguarded truth could undo the fragile peace she'd carved out in her final hour. So she complied, not because she believed, but because she had already lost everything else. And this, her final moment, was the only thing left she could still control. She knelt upright, no block, no restraints, just stillness. And then, without warning, the sword sliced clean through her neck. It was done. But the real performance was just beginning. Let me know when you're ready for Chapter 5, When Death Fails to Erase. Anne Boleyn's head was gone, but the work wasn't finished. As her blood soaked into the straw, the executioner did what was customary. He held up her head by the hair for the crowd to see. A final confirmation, a visual guarantee that the sentence had been carried out, a warning clear and theatrical. And yet in that moment something strange happened. Witnesses said her lips continued to move, that her eyes fluttered beneath the lids. It wasn't supernatural, it was science. The brain can remain active for seconds after decapitation, but to those who watched it felt like something else. It felt like defiance, as if she was still trying to speak, even without a voice. Then came the panic. No coffin had been prepared. Her attendants, shaken and pale, scrambled to find an old arrow chest, a wooden crate meant to store weaponry. It was all they had. The Queen of England was laid inside, hastily wrapped in linen, and carried to the chapel for a burial with no headstone, no ceremony, no prayer. That, too, was intentional. Henry didn't want to mark her death. He wanted to erase it. In the weeks that followed, her portraits disappeared. Her initials were chipped from palace walls. The court poets who once praised her wit and beauty now wrote verses calling her wicked, lustful, a mistake. Even her daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. Her household was disbanded, her future uncertain. Anne had died, yes, but what was really being executed was her memory. This wasn't just about eliminating a rival, it was about controlling the narrative, about turning a human being into a cautionary tale. In the hands of Henry and his advisors, Anne Boleyn became a myth the seductress who flew too close to the sun, a warning to other women who dared to wield power, who dared to speak, who dared to rise. And yet she endured, not in monuments, not in stained glass or royal decrees, but in the child she left behind. Elizabeth, once cast aside, would rise to become one of the most formidable monarchs in British history. And with her reign came a quiet vindication. Because no matter how carefully you stage a death, no matter how clean the cut or final the silence, some legacies refuse to die. Anne Boleyn didn't vanish. She haunted history.